Hi everyone, it's amazing to be here and thank you for inviting me. As a result for the synodal process, the Vatican's Commission on Spirituality subgroup published a document entitled Towards a Spirituality for Synodality. You can kind of see it in the picture there. In this talk, I want to reflect a bit on the theology outlined in the document and how it both applies and is troubled by the particular challenges for trans life as it appears in our societies today. So at the heart of this spirituality of synodality is a movement in the church towards the excluded and the marginalised. The document states that synodality strives to realise a vision of the church in which, following Pentecost, it is the new reality of communio/community which overcomes the ancient alienations introduced by personal and social sin. What this means is that through synodality, the church seeks to overcome the divisions and alienations in society and within itself that come from sin, both in a personal sense, which includes all of the ways we as individuals hurt and exclude one another, and also a social sense that encompasses all of the structures and dynamics that maintain the various exclusions and divisions which characterize our unjust societies today. Now, of course, there's a risk in attempting to overcome division, in that we can also try and overcome differences, coercively conforming everyone to our own expectations or beliefs about how people should be. However, the document aspires to a different kind of communion in synodality. First, it states that this communion is fundamentally a loving one, in which we live out God's love for others around us, as well as standing in loving relationship with God himself. And second, it states that this communion harmoniously encompasses people in all of their differences. This is a matter of preserving people's identities with regards to which they differ from one another, making these differences less an obstacle to communion and more the material of it. We relate to one another in our differences as different people, rather than despite these differences. In this latter respect, the document argues, synodality is deeply Eucharistic. The kind of communion aspired towards by the Synod is realised most fully in the Eucharist, in which all are united in their entirety without negating any aspect of themselves. All united in the body of Christ. This is an incredibly powerful statement of the importance of the vision of inclusion which underlies the synodal process. Lumen Gentium, the document in which the Second Vatican Council set out its vision of the nature of the Church in response to the dramatic transformations of the mid-20th century, describes the Eucharist as the source and summit of Christian life. To describe the communion of synodality in these terms is to say that it is the expression of the Church's deepest nature, that the Church can never find its fulfillment except in achieving it. But this kind of inclusion is easier talked about than actually achieved. You can probably think of all the ways in which the Church, despite its lofty vision, fails to bring about this communion. Indeed, there's a part of me that reacts to this idea of communion itself with deep suspicion. Ideas of social harmony can be vehicles for authoritarian political projects. Just as musical harmony, as we are taught to think of it in the UK at least, is governed by rules that are the product of specific musical cultures and traditions with their own histories of classist and racist exclusions, we might ask these metaphors questions like, who decides the rules of the harmony? What sounds get excluded? And if differences are to be harmonised, who is the composer who gets to do the harmonisation? Indeed, just as Western composers struggle to escape the historical baggage of their colonial musical tradition, the answers to these questions are likely going to be troubling to some degree, regardless of the political intentions of the person using the metaphor in the first place. On the other hand, though, this kind of suspicion is also sometimes a trap. We learn to be suspicious because of our histories of pain. We've all been hurt, perhaps particularly by the Church. And we want to anticipate the things that will hurt us in the future, to never be lured in, deceived, or trapped by them again. And so we are captured by our fear, driven to defensiveness and a kind of resignation to being threatened. But it gets in the way of us looking for more hopeful possibilities and finding the pleasures that they bring. And in this vein, this lecture aims to be more hopeful. I want to highlight what I see as an authentic impulse towards embracing the other in synodality, so conceived. And in doing so, I hope to show not only that synodality holds hopeful possibilities, but by extension, that the synod can and ought to be an occasion for bringing these possibilities into existence, particularly for trans people. Before I continue, however, it's worth stopping to clarify that although I am focusing on trans people in this talk, I expect that what I have to say will seem familiar to non-trans people in the audience too. While it's important not to conflate different dynamics of marginalisation and experiences of oppression, these things can take on similar forms. Similarly, marginalisation and axes of oppression cannot easily be disentangled from one another. The most famous example of this is Kimberly Crenshaw's recognition that Black women are disadvantaged in the justice system as both Black people and women, and that their Blackness and womanhood in this context have a hand in shaping one another in this regard. As she puts it, they intersect as one of the things on that kind of word thing that Gerald showed earlier. Yeah, so they intersect. And taking this kind of intersectional view discourages us from trying to stake out clearly defined, discrete, and essentialized understandings of various identities or social groups. And in this vein, the history of transness itself is bound up in the history of race and colonialism, sexism, homophobia, and many other issues. That is to say, what it is to be trans is bound up in many factors and influences which shape the experience and identity of other groups in society. And consequently, it ought not to be surprising that trans people's experiences resemble or overlap with those of other groups. And I encourage you to explore these familiarities and similarities, both privately and in the discussion session later, as it will help shed light not only on your experiences, but those of trans people too. And finally, if you don't see your experience reflected in this talk, know that it also engages you as someone who might participate in the synodal process with those who do. So one of the most important aspects of the synodal process's aspiration to inclusion is how it expresses itself in relation to decision-making. It's a major goal of the process. The document asserts that the synodal church is a discerning church, seeking to see all things in relation to God and God's providential plan for creation, such that it becomes able to make decisions in light of faith. This decision-making is framed in terms of inclusion, embodied in what the document calls consensus. And this is more than just a common agreement about the rightness of a particular decision or course of action. It will certainly reflect a coming together of the community, but it will allow for different levels of appropriation, insight, and understanding, as well as action. I'm just going to move this little window because I'm not sure if we can see the quotes otherwise. So the model for this coming together is the unity I mentioned previously, which does not erase difference, therein permitting these different levels of realization. In short, synodality aspires not just to inclusion in difference, but decision-making, which embodies this inclusion within the church as a community. Part of this inclusion is a matter of listening. The document explains that discernment requires us to be open to God's demands on us. And in this regard, it requires a humility that recognizes that we need God's grace to illuminate our entanglements with sin and liberate us from them. This includes illumination, where sin has clouded our knowledge and judgment, which in turn requires us to be receptive to others who may have the insights we need to guide us. Something that the document notes is especially the case when we are engaged in communal discernment. As with the language of communion and harmony, this language of receptiveness rings alarm bells. It can be used as a kind of shibboleth for a kind of passive hierarchical obedience in which receptiveness only really goes one way. However, in the document, this is not a simple restatement of this kind of hierarchy. Rather, it writes that it is important for discernment to recognize that every member of the church is both a disciple and a teacher. Indeed, one must be enrolled as a disciple in the school of the Lord to become a teacher. Hence, discernment requires humility to learn and follow on the path of its teachers, including bishops, priests, parents, and everyone who teaches by the witness of their life. In this vein, the document also states that a synodal church is a listening church, one facet of listening being an act of attention, a gift, a recognition of the other, a willing generosity to let them speak in their own voice without trying to first determine the categories or translating in order to make the challenge of the other more comfortable and acceptable. In this sense, listening also has an ethical dimension. To listen to someone means to treat them in a certain way. That is, as the document puts it, it carries an ethical commitment to walk with them. For once we attend to another, we make their lives and their story part of our story. This is especially true when we choose to privilege those whose lives suffer the violence of poverty and those who suffer the burden of rejection or marginalization, or carry the weight of false and distorting narratives. When we are listening, we are also consulting, genuinely seeking to draw upon the insight, experience, and wisdom of others. Keep in mind that line about false and distorting narratives. We'll come back to it later. But for now, the document emphasizes the importance of the poor, the marginalized, and the oppressed in this ethical commitment, stating that the church must offer them unqualified solicitude. And in the context of the synodal process, this means that the church also needs to understand the lives of those on the margins, for it is there that Christ is also to be found. And in this process, we are called not only to listen, but to listen with the poor, the marginalized, and those whose voices our societies can drown out, or whose presence can be made invisible. And crucially, it then also notes that we must recognize that it is not easy to involve people on the margins in processes which have not been developed with them at the heart. People on the margins and those who suffer the violence and vulnerability of poverty will often say unusual and unexpected things, things that are often counterintuitive and challenging. I can attempt to illustrate this slightly with this image, which actually makes me slightly uncomfortable, but perhaps also really embodies one of the more kind of uncomfortable aspects of marginalization and people's kind of struggles in the world. But here we need the grace to allow them their own voice and modes of expression, rather than trying to absorb them into conventional categories or institutional language. It will be necessary to allow our own language and concepts to be enriched symbolically, as well as verbally through these voices and histories from the margins. And I think that ultimately this is the most significant part of the document's vision of the synodal process. That the church must be open to listening to otherwise excluded voices, and not only where they are comfortable or familiar. Moreover, the church must not only be open to listening to them, but must be open to being influenced, indeed enriched, by these challenging voices. And it's this kind of challenge which I want to dwell on today. So in summary then, synodality, according to the Commission on Spirituality subgroup, aspires towards a communion expressed most fully in the Eucharist, in which all are included in and without erasing their differences. This inclusion requires listening, whereby various groups and individuals can come to mutually influence one another and the process. So what does this mean for trans people? Well, I think this poses a particular challenge for us, or rather, we pose a particular challenge for the synodal process so conceived. The reason for this is that it is hard to listen to trans people, not simply because our voices are otherwise unheard in the church, but because we need to discover or rediscover our truth in the first place before we can speak it. Part of this is because, as the document puts it, trans people are subject to many false and distorting narratives that need to be dismantled before we can be properly heard. But there is more to the situation than this. In fact, the part I want to focus on today stems from how that truth itself has historically been rendered silent, invisible, and unknowable, and would thus still need to be explored and articulated, even were we to divest ourselves of these false narratives. So to clarify before I move on, by our truth, I don't mean something subjective, so much as something that pertains to us, which we have appropriated for ourselves, and which we would offer to others to appropriate in turn. I have also used this word truth in the singular, and I don't mean to imply by this that there is one universal, essential transness to be discovered across all contexts and cultures, nor that this truth can be apprehended or articulated in its totality once and for all. There may be as many trans truths in this sense as there are trans people, and that truth or those truths continue to be elaborated so long as trans people continue to reflect on their lives. In using this singular word, I intend less to assert that trans truth is singular than to offer to others my identification and solidarity in our ongoing struggles against everything that silences and erases us across whatever differences might lie between us. What remains to be articulated is less a single, universal, and definitive truth than the many different ways in which our trans lives are realizing themselves amidst the silences and exclusions of the world today. Either way, let me give you an example of how our truth remains to be discovered. Perhaps the most striking one is the way that transness is obscured by the very kind of conditions of its emergence in our Western context. While there are and have been many trans people who live their trans lives without making use of medical technologies, public awareness of trans life is bound up in the accounts of that life developed by the medical establishment. In fact, the very idea of gender itself is a product of medicine. In the late 19th and 20th century, developments in sexology, particularly around what were known at the time as intersex conditions, which people now sometimes prefer to be called differences of sexual development, had come to challenge the idea that there were two immutable, discrete human sexes, defined as they were in terms of a broad set of features, including genetics and hormones and secondary sex characteristics. For example, many people were discovered to have characteristics from both categories. Likewise, new surgical techniques, as well as developments in endocrinology, which both revealed hormonal development to change over time and enabled doctors to shape this development, indicated that sex, so conceived, was far from fixed. These developments also challenged the norms attached to the idea of two immutable and discrete sexes. Society was organized around the idea that everyone was either a man or a woman from birth, the nature of each being understood as bringing different social roles and expectations. But if people could move between these categories, as well as occupy positions between or outside of them, then how could they be expected to conform to the roles which were seen as following from sexual identity as a man or woman, as people thought of it in those days? John Money, a sexologist working in the Johns Hopkins Clinic in the US during the 1950s and 60s, offered a solution, moving these norms from their foundation in a nature that could no longer support them to one in culture. He posited that everyone has a social gender, which orients them from birth towards one of these two roles. Clinicians had been diagnosing and treating people for what was then known as transsexuality since the 1920s, following Magnus Hirschfeld's work in his Institute for Sexual Wissenschaft in Berlin, which you may have heard of. What Money's approach offered was a new basis for this diagnosis. Transsexuality could be accounted for as a mismatch between one's physical sex and the significances attached to it by society and one's social gender. By looking for this mismatch, clinicians could then decide whether someone was an appropriate candidate for treatment or not. Because Money's account of gender was rooted in an attempt to shore up traditional gender roles, the gender clinicians were looking for was conceived in those traditional terms. For example, trans women had to want to be traditional women who, for example, wore skirts, did certain kinds of labor, and had sex with men. This meant that trans people had to convince clinicians that they would be a man or woman along these lines in order to access treatment. In turn, this had a conforming effect on prospective service users, including a silencing effect on people whose self-understanding wouldn't have met these expectations. Most famously, when the sexologist Harry Benjamin built on Money's ideas in his 1966 book, The Transsexual Phenomenon, which went on to become an important reference point for trans medicine, trans people shared the book within their communities and trained themselves to convince clinicians that they met its criteria and to avoid doing or saying things which would fail to do so. This in turn established a feedback loop where clinicians would constantly have their criteria validated by the trans people they encountered. The influence of this time can't really be understated. For example, it's some of Harry Benjamin's understandings of transness that we find in a kind of simplified form today in popular born in the wrong body narratives. The pervasiveness of these narratives testifies to just how powerful these diagnostic criteria were in shaping the kinds of trans lives and experiences that made themselves visible. And don't get me wrong, there are lots of people today who find these narratives really powerful and descriptive of their experience and their reality, and I don't want to negate that. And I think that it does kind of really get to the heart of a certain kind of experience. But many trans people today don't find these narratives appropriate to their experience, even if they may sometimes kind of strategically use them to simplify interactions with cis people, that is kind of a thing. And people sometimes act as though kinds of trans life that reject traditional forms of masculinity and femininity are a new thing. Sometimes either as part of an attack on trans people as reinforcing stereotypes, or on more non-conforming trans people whom they portray as going too far, in contrast to supposedly more respectable trans people of the past. But the truth is that trans life has always been more varied, more dynamic, and perhaps more radical than was allowed by gatekeepers. Yet because these kinds of trans lives and experiences have historically been silenced, with the people who live them made to disavow them, they often remain unknown, unarticulated, and unexplored. This is not to say that there were no trans people working to overcome this alienation, speaking their reality against these pressures. We might cite the birth of academic trans studies. Obviously, as an academic, I leaped to this immediately, but there are other examples too. So we might cite the birth of academic trans studies in the 1990s and early 2000s as one example of this, with many of its most prominent thinkers like Sandy Stone and Susan Stryker rejecting this medicalized paradigm. There were also doubtless trans people who developed their own understanding of their lives despite these pressures, either as individuals or in community, and who may have even written their thoughts down, but remained in or faded into obscurity, meaning that very few, if any others, could have read their thoughts and applied them to their own lives. More recently, increased trans visibility, for all it can be a curse, along with the unparalleled connectivity offered by social media, and quite frankly, incredible cultural and political shifts, at least in certain contexts, have also empowered trans people to encounter the possibility of and narrate their own lives in ways that would have been unimaginable a few decades ago. However, whatever the nuances of the situation, the silencing effect of these dynamics is still very much real. This kind of history might be seen as a sort of community trauma almost, cutting off present generations from their roots and alienating them from not only other trans people, but from themselves. The trauma from which we may be recovering, but have yet to truly transcend. And I haven't even mentioned all of the other factors which have a similar effect. For example, the medicalization of transness also had the effect of portraying it as an expression of the will and agency of the clinician, negating trans agency. The focus of trans medicine, as well as social expectations about life following it, such as going stealth, have also historically had a focus on normalizing bodies and therein making transness invisible, rather than on facilitating more varied forms of trans life, including those which revolve less around conformity to wider social norms. Transness is also a diverse phenomenon, and there are so many forms of transness which even now rarely get a chance to speak for themselves, let alone be heard. There are contexts in which the kinds of alienations mentioned above persist in even more dramatic and murderous forms than I personally might encounter as a sort of middle-class white woman in the UK. There are cultures in which what passes for transness is an expression of a colonized culture, with its silencing being bound up in that colonization. There are communities who, denied access to academia and other spaces of power, have their own theories and understandings, which, because of their marginalization, struggle to be spoken in wider society. There are the ambiguities of transness itself, which put into question the connections we might otherwise make across cultures, contexts, and historical moments, drawing us into a restless movement between identification and difference that is too open-ended to fully capture in any one account. There's the fact that we constantly face a demand to justify ourselves and our rights to an often ambivalent audience, stealing time from our attempts to explore and witness to the rich possibilities of trans life. There's also the fact that the demands and challenges facing us are often urgent and unaccommodating of the contemplation, reflection, and uncertainty required for true self-knowledge. And finally, pertinently to this talk, most of the positive developments I've mentioned have taken place in a secular context. There are some out-trans people, including some trans theologians, beginning to overcome this alienation in a church context, discerning where amidst the silences of trans life the word of God is speaking, but they are still often highly marginal and very few indeed. And there are many other things that I just don't have time to mention. Ultimately then, we do not yet know ourselves. We do not have the language. So much must still be spoken for the first time, or for the first time again. So how does this affect the synodal process? To summarize what I talked about previously, the Commission on Spirituality subgroup teaches that the goal of the synodal process is a Eucharistic communion, which includes everyone in their differences. One of the goals of the process is discernment, in which everyone is included this way in the decision-making process. This must involve a process of listening, in which the marginalized are allowed to speak as and for themselves. Part of this involves getting back behind the false narratives that misrepresent marginalized groups, but for trans people, it's a little more complex. Before we can articulate our lives and experiences to the wider church, we must first articulate these things to ourselves. Before the hearing, which is so vital to the synodal process, can occur, there must thus be the opportunity for creativity, for trans people to discover for ourselves what trans life might mean and where God might be present in it. This is a difficult process, or a difficult situation, but I see great hope in it for the synodal process. As we've seen, the theology of the synodal process contains a powerful impulse to truly embrace the other, even in their challenging aspects. It is both sad but wonderful how striking these themes are, and I pray that they might apply to trans people too. If so, then perhaps the synodal process can also be an opportunity for trans people to not just speak their reality to the church, but to speak it to themselves in a context of ecclesial belonging, to see themselves as part of the church, to see their objectified, abused, and excluded bodies incorporated into that one body, their silenced tongues speaking in that same spirit. Perhaps it can if we are brave enough, resilient enough to let it. And who knows what possibilities will emerge in these strange conditions. I say we have to be brave, though, and resilient, because I'm under no illusions that doing so will be easy. For all its aspirations towards inclusion, there are so many ways in which the church can and will betray them. But I truly do believe that the synodal process can, and perhaps can only, find its fulfillment in their realization in this way. This hope is drawn from the fundamental conviction I find in liberation theology, that in the Gospels, Christ identifies himself with the excluded and the oppressed, concerning himself with their lives and offering salvation not just in spiritual terms, but in the liberation from all things which prevent them from flourishing as human beings. This is a conviction which leads us to recognize that Christ is continuing his work today wherever the excluded are becoming included and the oppressed are being liberated. Where the excluded and the oppressed can see this identity in the Gospels, where they can see themselves and their liberation in Christ's story. They can thus see Christ in themselves and their liberation today. The self-discovery of trans life is ultimately a revelation of truth once invisible amidst oppression and falsehood. It's a revelation of truth not simply covered up, but made inconceivable by a society that permitted trans life only insofar as it was invisible, silent, and impossible. It is therefore also a discovery of possibility amidst impossibility, emerging from the nothingness that society condemned it to be. I see this as bearing up a profound parallel with Christ's passion and resurrection, and thus also the communion sought by the synodal process, which seeks to embody the communion of the Eucharist in which these events are eternally lived out. When Christ in the Gospels is called before Pilate, he is asked, "Are you king of the Jews?" Christ's answer is ambiguous. Matthew, Mark, and Luke's Gospels have in reply, "You say so." In doing so, Christ refuses to assert his kingship. Instead, he leaves it up to Pilate to recognize it for himself. John's Jesus is more mysterious, challenging Pilate by responding with a question. "Do you ask this on your own account, or have others spoken to you about me?" Here he performs the same maneuver, explicitly highlighting the question of Pilate's own recognition by distinguishing a question that truly comes from Pilate from one that is simply repeating second-hand accusations. He eventually follows up his remark with the even more confusing, "My kingdom is not of this world," before re-emphasizing his challenge to Pilate, reframing it in terms of Pilate's relation to truth. "You say I am a king. I was born for this. I came into the world for this, to bear witness to the truth. And everyone who belongs to the truth listens to my voice." If Christ had given Pilate a straight answer, he would have merely been telling Pilate of his kingship, demanding his hearing and obedience, something which his shift to discussing truth in John reframes in terms of simply bringing truth for Pilate to receive passively. But instead, he indicates something important about this truth. That it is ultimately up to others, such as Pilate, to appropriate that truth for themselves, to actively recognize it and make it a part of their lives. Indeed, the strange and mysterious claim in John that his kingdom is not of this world redoubles this challenge. Were he to just claim worldly kingship, Pilate would have recognized him as a simple seditionist concerned with overturning Roman rulership. A view reflected by the chief priests when they respond to Pilate's question, "Shall I crucify your king?" with, "We have no king but Caesar." Pilate could have simply dismissed his claims as incompatible with the political reality he recognized and was charged to defend. But instead, Christ intensified the mystery, drawing in Pilate to think, reflect, and recognize. Pilate, of course, fails to rise to Jesus' challenge. John's Pilate, in particular, dismisses it, asking instead, "What is truth?" After which Christ refuses to speak to him any further, except to render meaningless the threat implicit in Pilate's question. "Do you not know that I have the authority to release you and the authority to crucify you?" Christ replies, "You would have no authority over me at all if it had not been given to you from above. That is why the man who handed me over to you had the greater guilt." Christ's response does not even acknowledge the threat. Instead, it strips the power from Pilate's claim. He enjoys his power because it has been given to him. It's not real power, just the effect of someone else's power. Hence, he cannot simply demand Christ to give over the truth to him on his own terms. He must instead receive it as Christ offers it, as something that implicates him, having a claim on his life, rather than as something to simply be received from the position of untouchable power implicitly claimed to him as threat. In this regard, this moment is the same as when Christ is taken before Herod in Luke. Luke writes that Herod was delighted to see Jesus. He was hoping to see some sign done by him. Christ refuses to perform for him, again highlighting that his truth is not something that should simply be offered up to someone in a position of relative power. In these scenes, I see trans people standing in the place of Jesus. We exist in a world that demands we offer our truth up in an acceptable form, decided by the world from a position of relative power, from which it can never be moved to reevaluate where it stands in relation to us. And like Christ, when we fail to do so, recognition of that truth is withheld. The gospel narratives now move on to Christ's passion. Here it is not enough for the Romans to simply ignore Christ's truth. They parody it in a grotesque inversion that takes the things that would normally signify that truth and makes them signify its opposite. In Luke, Pilate has already begun this process, returning Jesus to Pilate, in Luke, Herod has already begun this process, returning Jesus to Pilate in a rich cloak. In Matthew, it is the governor's soldiers who put a scarlet cloak upon him, signifying military leadership, along with the crown of thorns and a reed scepter, and then kneel and hail him mockingly as a king. In Mark, the cloak is purple, signifying royalty. And finally, Christ is led away to die a humiliating and accursed death on the cross, under an ironic declaration of his kingship. All of the things which might have signified Christ's kingship are turned to silencing his call to recognition, becoming objects of a cruel comedy whereby Christ is rendered laughable and pathetic. I also see trans people in this. Those whose truth is not permitted find it silenced through mockery and humiliation, in which they're reduced to pitiful parodies. Gatekeeping, which permits no deviation from the norm, and the physical violence through which trans people are terrorized and thus policed around the world. A further parallel lies in John, wherein a grammatical ambiguity also lets us read when Pilate seated himself upon the chair of judgment at Gabbatha, as him seating Christ there. Perhaps this ambiguity is just a quirk of the writing, but perhaps the grammatical overlap between Christ and Pilate here might also signify not just Christ's silencing, but the appropriation by Pilate of Christ's very powers of judgment themselves. Just as Christ on the throne slips grammatically into Pilate on the throne, Christ's judgment is transformed into Pilate's, much like when trans people are forced to account for themselves in terms foisted on them by a hostile society. Yet in the resurrection, this inversion itself is inverted. Christ rises, his body still marked with its wounds, and the very things which signified the impossibility of his truth become the means and the signs of its realization. Nothing shows this more clearly than when the disciples recognize Christ not in his glory, but in the very woundedness of his body. In the resurrection, Christ takes up the very things that silence his truth and subverts them, making them testify to his truth instead. And this finally is where I see the good news of the gospel as being good news for trans people. Christ's truth was silenced, and yet it emerged from within the conditions of its silencing. It took the very things that silenced it and found a way to make itself heard within them. Even when there seemed to be nothing for it, when it seemed to be nothing in itself, it found a way to speak forth its word. If we as trans people in our struggle against the silencing that has for too long sought to rob us of our truth can see ourselves in Christ here, then we can see Christ in ourselves too. If Christ is working in our lives in this way, then the good news of the resurrection is also the good news of the resurrection of our truth. Indeed, we're already seeing this happen in the continued and now flourishing work of trans people to articulate our lives and experiences for ourselves once again. Let us now remember how the synodal process finds its fulfillment in Eucharistic communion. If the Eucharist is indeed the sacrifice of the passion and resurrection in the body of Christ, as we believe, then this too culminates in a resurrection from all worldly oppression into inclusion in worldly communion. If the resurrection of Christ's silenced truth is the resurrection of our own, then the culmination of the Eucharist includes this resurrection. And if this resurrection lies at the heart of the Eucharistic communion of the synodal process, then it not only can, but I think must happen there too. Finally then, this makes us look at the Church itself anew. I mentioned earlier how the Second Vatican Council described the Eucharist as the source and summit of Christian life. If synodality seeks to embody Eucharistic communion, then the Church finds its fulfillment in synodality. And if synodality can include a creative moment in which trans people can transcend our history of silencing and come to articulate our lives and experiences for ourselves, then the Church finds its fulfillment in this too. The Church finds its fulfillment not simply in listening, but in what might be described as a process of true accompaniment that does not seek to gradually or sensitively steer trans people towards a norm, but simply to journey with us into this truth. That is to say, it requires the Church to take seriously what the document hints at when it states that we are called not only to listen, but to listen with the poor, the marginalised, and those whose voices our society can drown out or whose presence can be made invisible. This will require a different methodology, a way of accompaniment and walking with or alongside, so that we come to see reality from their perspective. When I said a moment ago that this resurrection must happen in the synodal process, I did not mean must in the sense that it definitely will happen, but that in the strongest terms it should. Viewing the synodal process as the fulfillment of the Church helps us to think this through. We know full well that the Church often fails to realise itself, to live up to its vocation, to be what it truly is. And I think it is important to have an unvarnished view of this reality. In this spirit also, my standing here and theologizing is only so helpful. I can say what ought to happen as much as I like, and maybe a few people will be motivated by my doing so. But being able to say these things is not the same as being able to promise them. Yet we also know that Christ is risen, that his body lives in the world today. And we know that even if that body's fulfillment at times seems to lie more in the not yet than the already, it nevertheless looks forward to that future on the foundation of a promise from the one who always keeps them. A promise which, unlike any I could hope to make, does not rely on our fallible efforts for its realization. I am not naive enough to think that we will see this promise completely fulfilled in the synodal process. But I can say that I believe in it, and that we may yet still see it fulfilled in part. At the very least, I believe it belongs to our vocation to work towards that fulfillment. Not just trans people, but all of us. Because we are all part of that one body, born from and called to live out this resurrection every day of our life. Thank you.